Hello and welcome to a lecture on liberal education. The main objectives of our today's deliberation are to understand the importance of liberal education, to trace the history of liberal education, to try to know the relationship between liberal education and professional education, to highlight the objectives of liberal education, and finally we'll try to understand the provision for liberal education. Let me first of all give you a brief introduction about the concept of liberal education. Liberal education is more than classical education, more than an education in English literature. It is more than an education in what is called the humanities, and more than training in virtues. A liberal education is so much more than what passes today as an education in English. The following words of English critic and writer I.A. Richards seem weirdly unreal. Quote, "We teachers of English have a great responsibility. We are the guardians of the main channel through which has come down to us. Whatever is high-hearted, courageous, noble and passionate in its hope for man, whatever is faithful, whatever is honorable, whatever is serious and sincere, whatever is most aware of man's nature and his fate, whatever is most ready to uphold and defend it." Unquote. That is fine, but few teachers of English deserve it. Even they performed all that their subject made possible, they would not be sufficient agents of a liberal education. Liberally educated people are skeptical of their own traditions. They are trained to think for themselves rather than conform to higher authorities. It also cultivates active citizenship through off-campus community service, internships, research and study abroad. Some faculty see this movement towards civic engagement as more pedagogically powerful than traditional classroom teaching. But opponents argue that the education occurring within an academic institution must be purely intellectual and scholarly. Liberal education combines an education in the classics, English literature, the humanities and moral virtues. The term liberal education in the modern sense should not be confused with liberal arts education. The latter deals with academical subjects, while the former deals with ideological subjects. Indeed, a liberal arts education does not necessarily include a liberal education, and a liberal arts program may even be specialized as a vocational program. Now, let's understand the meaning of liberal education. Liberal or general education has been defined as, quote, "a curriculum or part of a curriculum aimed at imparting general knowledge and developing general intellectual capacities in contrast to a professional, vocational or technical curriculum," unquote. It is characterized by its focus on the whole development of an individual apart from his occupational training. It includes the civilizing of his life purposes, the refining of his emotional reactions, and the maturing of his understanding of the nature of things, according to the best knowledge of our time. Ideas of what constitutes a liberally educated person vary. A recent formulation by a member of our task force describes such an educated person as someone who, number one, can think and write clearly, effectively and critically, and who can communicate with precision, cogency and force. Number second, has a critical appreciation of the ways in which we gain knowledge and understanding of the universe, of society and of ourselves. Number three, has a broad knowledge of other cultures and other times and is able to take decisions based on reference to the wider world and to the historical forces that have shaped it. Number four, has some understanding of and experience in thinking systematically about moral and ethical problems. And finally, number five, has achieved depth in some field of knowledge. Liberal education is a term used for multidisciplinary approach to education. Liberal education emphasizes a learning system of education which provides students the choices to take courses which are varied and responds to the discovery and exploration the students needs to make. Students can experience a broad spectrum of courses and they have the possibility of meandering into streams of knowledge to discover which their calling is, and which stream they respond to. Their curriculum is not open-ended. There is a structure, and the student experiences some courses across the streams of existing knowledge to be able to make very well-informed choices in their specializations. It is an interdisciplinary platform of education that propagates different models and paradigms from various learning disciplines. This platform develops students with abilities to connect and integrate knowledge, helping them to apply it in current and future real-world scenarios. Liberal education strives to deliver an academic experience that fosters intellectual curiosity, a critical thought process, self-reflection, leadership and teamwork skills, a sense of commitment and professionalism, and a heightened sensitivity to one's socio-cultural environment. It lays emphasis on the creation of a learning environment where the student takes the responsibility of learning and the role of the teacher is to facilitate the learning process. Now, let's discuss some of the definitions of liberal education. The concept of the term liberal education is very wide and comprehensive. It implies education for freedom to use one's intellectual and emotional powers, freedom from slavery to one's natural and primitive tendencies, freedom from cramping influences of ignorance, prejudices and wrong beliefs, and freedom to think independently. According to Ross, quote, "Liberal education has the ideal of higher freedom of mind and spirit, of economic freedom and of self-discipline," unquote. According to Spence Robert, quote, "Liberal education is one which makes men and women capable of understanding the world in which they live and which helps them to contribute to the understanding of its problems," unquote. The American Association for the Advancement of Science describes a liberal education in this way, quote, "Ideally, a liberal education produces persons who are open-minded and free from provincialism, dogma, preconception, and ideology, conscious of their opinions and judgments, reflective of their actions, and aware of their place in the social and natural worlds," unquote. According to James Engel, the author of The Value of a Liberal Arts Education, quote, "A liberal education provides the framework for an educated and thoughtful citizen," unquote. Now, we can conclude that liberal education liberalizes our mind. As a result, the individual possesses the powers of self-control, adaptation, thinking, and reasoning. He can think independently. He is free from ignorance and prejudice. He is a free man of the universe of truth, beauty, and goodness. It is this education which represents the achievements of the human spirit, thus adding a humanistic touch to the whole system. Dear students, let's acquaint ourselves with the history of liberal education. Definitions of liberal education may be broad, generalized, and sometimes even contradictory. It is at once the most enduring and changeable of academic traditions. Axelrod, Anasif, and Lynn suggest that conceptions of liberal education are rooted in the teaching methods of ancient Greece, a slave-owning community divided between slaves and freemen. The freemen, mostly concerned about their rights and obligations as citizens, received a non-specialized, non-vocational, liberal arts education that produced well-rounded citizens aware of their place in society. At the same time, Socrates emphasized the importance of individualism, impressing upon his students the duty of man to form his own opinions through reason rather than indoctrination. Athenian education also provided a balance between developing the mind and the body. Another possibility is that liberal education dates back to the Zhou dynasty, where the teachings of Confucianism focused on propriety, morality, and social order. Horner also suggests that Jesus was a liberal educator as, quote, "He was talking of a free man capable of thinking for himself and of being a responsible citizen," unquote. But Liberal education is still commonly traced back to the Greeks. While liberal education was stifled during the barbarism of the early Middle Ages, it rose to prominence once again in the 11th and 12th centuries, especially with the re-emergence of Aristotelian philosophy. The 13th and 14th centuries saw a revolt against narrow spirituality, and educators started to focus on the human rather than God. This humanist approach favored reason, nature, and aesthetics. Study of the classics and humanities slowly returned in the 14th century, which led to increased study of both ancient Greek and Latin. In the 15th and 16th centuries, liberal education focused mostly on the classics and commoners. However, were not too keen on studying the classics, so they instead took up vernacular languages and literature, and also the sciences. Until at least the 20th century, both humanist and classicist influences remained in the liberal education, and proponents of a progressive education also embraced the humanist philosophy. Study of the classics continued in the form of the Great Books program. While liberal education is a Western movement, it has been influential in other regions as well. For example, in Japan, during the general liberalism of Saiho period, there was a liberal education movement that saw the establishment of a number of schools based on liberal education in the 1920s. Now, let's trace the relationship of liberal education with professional education. Liberal education and professional education have often been seen as divergent. German universities moved towards more professional teaching in the 19th century, and, unlike American students who still pursued a liberal education, students elsewhere started to take professional courses in the first or second year of study. In the early 20th century, American liberal arts college still required students to pursue a common curriculum, whereas public universities allowed a student to move on to more pragmatic courses after having taken general education courses for the first 2 years of study. As an emphasis on specialized knowledge grew in the middle of the century, colleges began to adjust the proportion of required general education courses to those required for a particular major. As Professor Martha, University of Chicago, points out, standardized testing has placed more emphasis on having technical knowledge, and its quantitative multiple choice nature prompts role learning in the classroom. At the same time, humanistic concepts such as imagination and critical thinking, which cannot be tested by such methods, are disappearing from college curriculum. 30% of college graduates in the United States are likely to eventually work in jobs that do not exist yet. Proponents of a liberal education therefore argue that a post-secondary education must prepare students for an increasingly complex labor market. Rather than provide narrowly designed technical courses, a liberal education would foster critical thinking and analytical skills that allow the students to adapt to a rapidly changing workforce. The movement towards career-oriented courses within a liberal education has begun at places like Dartmouth College, where a journalism course combines lessons on writing styles with reading and analyzing historical journalism. An American survey of CEOs published in 1997 revealed that employers were more focused on the long-term outcomes of education, such as adaptability, than college students and their parents, who were more concerned with the short-term outcomes of getting a job. Dear students, let's further talk about various provisions of liberal education. Ronald B. Esquivel said, only 8% of colleges provide a liberal education to 4% of students in the United States. Liberal education revived 3 times in the United States during periods of industrialization and shifts of social preoccupations before World War I, after World War II, and in the late 1970s. Perhaps as a reaction against over-specialization in undergraduate curriculum, currently pressures from employers, parents, and governments have defined the type of education offered at educational institutions. Such trends have curtailed the role of education offered in America. Universities have now provided education for the sole purpose of preparing students for the workforce. This idea has influenced the credibility of liberal education, which has impacted how students view higher education. Politicians have influenced the type of education provided at universities. These politicians have been recently cutting the funds for universities, applying immense pressure on higher educational institutions. Lack of funds have caused many to abandon the liberal arts curricula. Therefore, universities have been forced to provide a curriculum useful for providing a vocational education. The lack of funds to maintain a balanced education system has caused American universities to provide an education with a lack of emphasis on liberal values. The disappearance of liberal education can also be traced to liberal arts colleges. Students are beginning to view higher education as a preparation for careers. This has then led to the natural selection of colleges. Obviously, the thought of having education that instructs to enhance the individual for the purpose of improving society does not meet current demands. Thus, as a result, liberal arts colleges are diminishing along with the emphasis on providing a liberal education. Chinese universities began to implement liberal curricula between the 1920s and 1940s, but shifted to specialized education upon the establishment of People's Republic of China in 1949. Higher education reform in the 1990s returned to liberal education. In 2000, Peking University started to offer a liberal education curriculum to its undergraduate students, followed by other institutions throughout the country. That is all about today's lecture. Hope you have enjoyed and understood. Thank you.